Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. I think Emmanuella highlighted so many important things that I'd like to talk about. Um, I think the plan for today is that I'll speak for maybe 30 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time to have conversations, discuss anything you might want to know. And as Emmanuella said, maybe use the question box, because that's probably a little bit easier. If you've been here from the beginning, you'll see the chat's quite busy, but we'll try to monitor and hopefully use the format to still get into a bit of a discussion of why you're interested in historical methods, what here would be relevant for you. And I thought about what to talk about today, and I really thought, well, the key issues are probably for an audience like the British Academy of Management around what historical methods actually bring to management research. And I mean that broadly: business, management, organization studies, international business. Because I think the question is a little bit, yes, there's a lot of potential, and Emmanuella mentioned the various ways in which people feel historical methods could really bring something to their specific research agendas. But I think there's also an overarching question around, what do historical methods actually contribute to management research? Do they contribute? Do they make a straightforward contribution? And where are we now? And is there even scope for more? Is this really something where, historical methods have been introduced, they've been accepted, and that's it? So I thought today to talk about three interrelated aspects. In particular, I want to talk about new data, because I think one of the main contributions historical methods can make to management research is to sensitize us to a new type of data. Or you might say, well, why new type of data? Historians work on old data. Well, yes, that's true, but I mean more in terms of the type of data rather than the age of the data. And here, this is really because historians increasingly think beyond traditional archives. Now, I do feel that traditional archives actually have a lot to offer for management scholars. They're perhaps an underused resource, but there are other quasi-archival repositories and sources, especially in the digital space, where historical methods, I believe, have quite a lot to offer. So you may be interested in historical methods without being interested in history. And I think as a management scholar, that is perfectly fine. And I think we're at an interdisciplinary intersection, so a lot of ways to engage with this is entirely possible. The second aspect I think that's important is new methods. So obviously you could say, again, historical methods, are they really new? Arguably, I think they are new, certainly in management studies, but you could also say, and going back to Emmanuella's point around the extreme tacitness, or sometimes people say the craft-like nature of historical methods, actually, a lot of these methods haven't really been described in a way that would have been accessible to management scholars, so they haven't really been that useful before. But in some ways, they probably haven't even been that useful to historians, because the more we get engaged in a methodological conversation, I think the better we also understand our own methodological practices and some of the diversity that exists. And that's been, again, it's one of these where you have this interdisciplinary engagement between people who were previously perhaps more in a historical department and are now in business schools, where they're also learning a lot from the practices in management. So new methods, I think, are not just methods that are being brought into the field, but I would also say there is an interdisciplinary methodological development going on, and there's quite a bit of novelty in this space. Finally, obviously, as is management, we need to talk about theoretical insights. And again, Emmanuella highlighted that often history is seen as a field with no theory, which is something that, I'd really push back on. I think it's misunderstood in the way that theory is used. So I think there are real opportunities to develop novel ways to understand organizational phenomena, and that's perhaps where the real contribution of historical work lies and may not yet be fully developed. So that's what I thought I'd talk about today. Hopefully there's something in there for whatever you're interested in and what you'd like to hear about. And I'm very happy to dive more deeply once we go to the discussion. So starting with new data, I think the important bit is really that, when we talk archives, we don't talk about the same thing. And I think this is a very common experience. If you work across interdisciplinary intersections, we all use words and concepts in slightly different ways. For me, the interesting thing is that while in management, I'd say scholars are better at conceptual clarity very often than historians, This is one where conceptual clarity is actually fairly weak. So management scholars will often use the term archival data, and it refers to any type of documentary material collected in various different ways. Could be data sets, could be just documents that picked up during field work. So it's quite a vague reference to a kind of data that is usually just used as background material. And I think the key thing for historians is this is our main data, and it has very specific attributes, and we work with it in a very specific way. So for us, being conceptually clear around the archive, while there is debate, is perhaps more important, because we also see that the differences between archives directly affect what you can actually do with your data. So for historians, archival sources are very specific things. They are always historically specific. That means they're very often unique. A single historical source may not exist more than once. I mean, there can be situations where it exists more than once, but normally they're unique. You're lucky that the one that you're holding was preserved. It's not necessarily that there are 5 other copies. So it's not like a library. It's not like published reports. This is very different material. Imagine you have the correspondence, what today would be email, and you get all of this business correspondence. That is a normal type of source for business historians to work with. And these are non-circulating documents. So again, they're not in libraries. If they're physical copies, you need to go to very specific places where they're stored. They're normally stored in boxes. And then these folders you see over there are folders in boxes. You need to go through a database to identify what you might want to look at. You call up the box, you open up, you look for the folder. And then each folder, as you can see there, might easily contain hundreds of papers. So ultimately, the individual source in there is within a profusion of other data. And this data really is different from, what is normally called secondary data, because this is naturally occurring. These are contexts that self-document. It emerges from normal organizational operations. It reflects the interests of people at the time. It reflects their practices, their norms, and it might be relevant to your research or not. So very often for historians, adapting your research questions to what you actually find and what you can actually do something with is quite a normal process. And that would be a lot less common for social scientists, who very often interview or collect data with a very specific research question that is set at the beginning. So archives are also contextually embedded. They're stored in particular places with particular purposes, and historians normally like to understand why and how this stuff survived, why it was put down in the first place, whether something is missing, whether there was intentionality in collecting it, and why is it being made available to you. And for business historians, that's probably even more important, simply because we don't work with public archives. A government department needs to deposit everything. A firm doesn't. So firms are only required to keep very few documents. They're not required to have historical archives, and they're not required to let you in as a researcher. So it's much more like field work than maybe what, your standard historian who writes big political thesis would encounter. So when you do work on organizational history, you're very much entering a fieldwork site where you need to negotiate access. So in some ways, the practice is also quite similar to what you would have for other social science projects. Now, the social scientific data that I find a lot of my colleagues in management organization studies expect to be in an archive is either these sort of reports you get online and the stuff you see published, which of course isn't very revealing, or it is documents that were perhaps previously primary. Let's say somebody did an interview study and then the UK Qualitative Data Archive, it's stored there and you can look at somebody else's research. And a lot of the discussion of secondary data deals with that. That's a real problem when historians try to position the data that they're working on, because for historical researchers, it's really naturally occurring data. And that differs fundamentally from researcher-constructed data sets. And many years ago, we sort of made this difference between researcher-constructed and found data, in the sense that every single time you have to go into the field, which is an archive, and you actually have to find the stuff that is relevant to your question. And at the beginning, when people were starting to publish historical research in business and management, it was very difficult translating that. And I think to some extent, it is still not entirely straightforward, because when you submit something to a journal, you say secondary data, there's an assumption it is a different kind of data from the stuff you actually encounter in an archive. And that's why I kind of feel archival research, even in your classic paper-based archives, there's so much material in there that most management scholars wouldn't expect. So once you actually start doing some historical research, you might find there's a lot more than what you expected. Now, I think these days the conversation has shifted a bit because more people are realizing that, oh yeah, my God, we're surrounded by huge amounts of data. Quite a lot of it is relevant to people who want to study practices, people, organizations, their interaction, the way this interacts with society at large. We're literally drowning in a sea of data because we have all the digital data. But look at some of the major management journals, and actually I'm not convinced we're seeing an awful lot of papers based on this. Like when I look for digital, I get a lot of papers about digital practices in organization or digital management or how teams work with digital, but these are normally then still interview based. So they're not actually working with the digital sources that are being generated. In some cases, that might also be due to GDPR. As we all know, it's not straightforward. But even if we didn't look for things that were necessarily under GDPR, we have basically the internet full of material where people self-disclose, where people self-organize, and where there's an awful lot of material available. Again, not something you see a lot of management or organizational or business papers being written on. So with existing approaches where you do see papers in this space, I feel you get to see some of it with discourse analysis and maybe narrative analysis. They engage with naturally occurring or naturalistic data. But first of all, these are not the only methods available. And secondly, they might also not be suitable for the kind of questions and problems and theories you might be interested in, because they normally stay at the level of language. And the question is really, how do you go beyond the document and the language into what you might want to look at? And somehow this tends to be more difficult for this kind of material, even though realistically, if you do an interview, you're still just working with language. So it's not that big a difference. So digital data in many ways represents a major source of the secondary data. It's largely underutilized. And I feel the main problem with that is that, again, secondary data is seen as something that used to be primary. So a researcher at some point constructed it. That's not true for the vast majority of digital data we have available. Some of it, of course, is. We have data sets we access through paid or not paid for databases, and we often access that online, so it feels like it's sort of almost contiguous with the internet. But there's an awful lot of free stuff there that people collate, where people create things, and that exists as treasure troves of sort of secondary data. I think where historical approaches really have something to offer to management researchers who want to use the methods, but maybe not necessarily look at history, is that it allows you to dive into this naturalistic and naturally occurring data. And you can do it at scale, because really there's an awful lot out there. And the biggest problem most of the time is actually justifying to the journal what you're doing and how this data is different and how you can use it in a rigorous way. And I think for historical researchers, we've, over the years, we've spent a lot of time justifying our archival data. And in many ways, that's very, very similar to what you would be doing in a digital space. So I think the other important thing to highlight is really that when we talk about historical methods, we're not talking about the historical method. I think when people started sort of engaging with history, there was a general sense there is the historical method. You're either using that, and if you don't using that, you dare not say you're using anything historical. I think we've moved beyond that in a way that we no longer talk about anything singular, but we recognize that there are multiple and related approaches. There's some that are very commonly used and you hear about all the time, and they might really be the most relevant ones to you. But they definitely kind of represent perhaps the biggest opportunity for management researchers to engage with. And some of the key methodological developments here are, on the one hand, archival research. So having a systematic examination of historical sources or indeed digital sources, and to be very clear about how you're researching that and justifying this type of data, particularly in the context of, say, generating management organization theory. And the other practice is sometimes known as critical source analysis. Now, I feel for somebody in management and business, calling it analysis, it's more a form of interpretation. And given what our usage of analysis and interpretation is like in business and management, I feel it would be much easier to refer to as a critical source interpretation because it's much closer to the interpretive practices in our field. And this is really based on a sort of interrogation of the sources. And that really helps with the fact that this is naturally occurring data, right? This is not data any researcher filtered and made sure it fitted and it had the right standards of rigor. So critical source interpretation is a means of creating that filtering mechanism with data that you're getting secondhand, really. And that means you have to be just more critical and be more careful with that data, but also sort of interpretive and analytical work. Now, very often, I think a lot of this is not very clear because in history, a lot of these approaches you'll find that have sort of epistemological underpinnings, just like in management research. Unfortunately, going back to Emmanuella's point about the tacitness and the craft-like nature, historians not so much aware about it. Hey, Andre, I've seen you raised a hand. Not sure you can speak. I assume not. Maybe if you could put it in the chat, and if there is a question, I can have a quick look. If there's something we need to clear up now. Okay, can't see anything. If it's okay, I'll go on and maybe just add something to the questions. And if it's a question of understanding right now, maybe just put it in the chat and Emmanuella can give me a wave if it's something we need to resolve. Okay, thanks. So going back to epistemology, historians basically have epistemological disagreements just like everybody else. So that's in part the problem around how do you use historical methods. So you'll get people using it differently. A while ago, I wrote a sort of piece trying to map it, but it really also trying to map this intersection where we work into management and where we just need to show much greater awareness of what are these epistemological underpinnings. So you get more positivist historians, you get more critical and interpretive historians, just like you would in business and management. And really, there's probably different sets of the historical debate that work for you, and it helps to kind of be able to locate yourself within that. Now, critical source interpretation, I'd really say, is perhaps the most important one and the one that almost all historians share. So it's the one where, you know, differences in interpretation, differences in approach matter the least, because critical source interpretation seeks to really interrogate historical evidence precisely because, you know, this was created somewhere, we don't necessarily know where. In a good archive, we actually know quite a lot about it, and critical source interpretation is a way of bringing this contextual information into the analysis, and it helps you interpret the meaning of the source. So really, when we interrogate historical evidence, we try to bring in a systematic framework of interpretation that examines sources in terms of who were the audiences to this source. You know, if you've got business internal documents, it's very different to a report, and you might get people with lots of different views arguing something, marginal notes. So you get a real sense of what perhaps a meeting would be like. So if you go through meeting notes today, you know, the meeting notes in the actual meeting could be very different, but you should still get a sense of the meeting from the meeting notes. They're often different purposes, and you'll also find lingo. I mean, most of us work in universities, I'm sure you're aware, and there's acronyms, lots of lingo. Happens when you look at organizational archives all the time. And learning to understand what that means, getting the cues and becoming absorbed in this field and understanding how things were meant within context. And let's face it, often we go back in time where people held values that today we might not entirely agree with. Needless to say, you get that in archival sources, and that is revealing and important and analytically valuable. So the essential questions, and really as part of critical source interpretation, you can ask lots of questions of the source, and the idea is really to question the source, but also the archive, why the source is there. You normally ask who is the intended audience. If you have something internal that was really meant not for public consumption, very often that's where they disclose the most interesting things, just like in our organizational life today. What was the purpose of creating this document? Are they part of a formal communication? Are they informal? What does it tell you about the way the organization communicates? There's a fantastic book about modes of communication by Joanne Yates. looking really at how structures and systems of communication build organizations. It tells you a lot how you should interpret the content of something within context, because the meaning can shift within context, and knowing what happened at the same time in the sector, in the organization, between individuals tells you an awful lot. And sometimes it takes a long time to fully get that context. And in a way, you asked us to understand how much evidentiary weight can this source bear? How do you want to interpret it? And how reliable do you find the material? But the reliability entirely depends on also the research question you ask, right? So some questions you might need facts. For some questions, you really might want to see differences in opinion and political moves that are being made in the organization. And all of that is potentially something you can do with historical sources. And in a way, I think here's another opportunity, even if, you don't really want to be a historical researcher, perfectly fine. But historical approaches such as source interpretation can be really useful in informing other qualitative methods. So there is an ongoing discussion within qualitative scholars, particularly for organization studies and management, where they're actually highlighting that there is this potential. So in an interesting piece, Schaefer and Alverson argued that a lot of researcher-generated interview data is interpreted as if it was fact, or at the very least, even if interviewers, the researchers, are more critical of their own interviews, it is not very explicitly discussed in the methods. So in many ways, the sort of critique that historians do of their underlying data would probably be actually also of usefulness for interview research. And then David Silverman, of course, has said for a long time that in many ways you co-construct the interview. And if you really want to go at the practices, maybe you need to organizational documents to see what the practices are, rather than ask people in an interview what their practices are, because they clearly will give you a filtered view of what a practice is. So there's a lot of opportunities to kind of delve into historical methods without necessarily wanting to do historical research, where potentially some of these practices can really help. And again, I think the big opportunity here is really on the digital side. But then, let's face it, historians and those historical researchers who kind of maybe had their training outside business schools have quite a lot to learn from business and management researchers. And I think this is a really interesting space where new methods are emerging, and also new awareness or new problems and new concepts come into the methodological discussion. And these methodological challenges I find in historical research are often around the data method fit. So whereas the historical research been really good at interrogating the quality of the data, they're a lot less good in actually showing how the data and the method then gets interpreted and leads to theory, like this data method fit or presenting data reduction processes. I realize not everybody's a fan of the Joya method because it's come to rule everybody who does a qualitative piece of work for a journal, which was, I don't think, ever its intention. But the beauty of it and many other qualitative approaches is how well it presents the data reduction process that you go through as a management scholar. And that's something that I feel for historical researchers could really still be further developed. Just checking, my camera seems to have frozen again. Am I back? Hopefully.
Yes, Stephanie, we can hear you well. There is no disruption or problems with the sound, and now we can see you well as well.
I don't know, this camera seems to be a bit dicey. Sorry about that. So yeah, presenting data reduction processes, sorry to interrupt there. I think this is much, much better in management, whereas the sort of interrogation of the underlying data is much, much better in historical practice. And it's really a question of, can you take the best from both traditions and bring that together and actually make this incredibly useful to business and management scholars and expand our repertoire of what we can do with all the data that's available. Another area I think is questions of credibility, trustworthiness, and validity. Depending on the tradition, you spend a lot or very little time on it in management. But I think the interesting question is, it's often about how well are you representing the underlying data. It's not so much how you question the quality of the underlying data. And these, I think, are interesting questions where I think from this sort of methodological perspective, there's real scope to further expand some of the potential contributions that have come from integrating historical approaches more into management. And finally, I think if you are interested in doing historical research, for me, there's still a really big question about how historical research is actually presented. Is it presented as a narrative, or is it presented as an analysis? The problem with, say, organizational management or business analyses, they're not very often over time, whereas most historians work over time. I mean, the only exception here would probably be process scholars. So really, I think there's still some ongoing debates, and there's also a lot of opportunities to kind of make this fit with what makes sense to you, to your research question, to your approach. And to put in a quick plug, I do apologize, Emmanuella already mentioned it, but 2 years ago, we published the Handbook of Historical Methods for Management, and actually the main aim with that book was really to get a lot of different scholars to talk about how this was useful, what were the key issues. And to be honest, I'm quite proud of this book that I co-edited, because I think we brought together a really wide variety of different perspectives. So that's very much a book that is very clear that there isn't just the one size fits all, and depending on where you're coming from, what you want to achieve and what your orientation is, there's probably a way that historical methods could be useful for you. Maybe worthwhile highlighting Emmanuella in her course has have a wonderful chapter in there highlighting all the myths, some of which she elaborated at the beginning, around what historical methods actually are. And I think each field might have their own myths, including it's just about the past. I think, as you can see from here, sure, the past is important, but realistically, you can do a lot of things with historical methods. And then, you know, history isn't always just about the past. History is also about how we got here, to understand the sort of the long history of the present moment. So one of the areas I thought I should probably highlight, simply because it is something where I kind of feel there is a lot of potential usefulness, but also I never quite understood why we have so little interaction in the space, though I hope this will change, is the question of oral history. Because oral history is a type of history that actually does interviews. So not every historian will go to an archive. Very often they question why certain things are not in the archive. So there will be a lot of work around doing semi-structured interviews, or something similar to life history interviews, seeking to raise data about the past, about people's experience of the past. And that seems a very easy crossover for most management scholars. Interestingly enough, it hasn't really been this big crossover, and I always found that very curious. But there are a number of issues that I think may well cause problems. So first one is that in oral history, you normally have named interviewees. That would be the traditional approach to oral history. I think it's fair to say when you work with organizations, that might well be a standard where simply in an interdisciplinary space, we might have to sort of admit that's not as likely to happen. The other thing that happens with oral history is that archived transcripts and recordings are normally archived. So you'll find oral history archives, many of them are now online. And again, it's been an absolute mystery to me why organizational researchers do not use that more. The British Library famously had a fantastic oral history resource. It was all online. Well, they still have it, but as you know, they had the whole attack on their digital infrastructure. So at the moment, it's inaccessible. But as a wide-ranging set of oral history interviews, they're about finance and the City of London and its history, about regulation and energy infrastructure, and lots of other subjects. But many of them are deeply, deeply organizational, business-focused, professionals-focused. So all areas where organization scholars would really normally research, but we've seen very little work on these resources. And then, of course, this is all publicly available materials for secondary reuse. Often business and management, that's not so commonly done, but clearly in the social sciences, the pressure to make data both open and reusable, also if you're a qualitative scholar, is growing. So realistically, I kind of feel this is maybe an area where some of the historical practices are really where the journey is going to go in qualitative social science. So this is just a bit of a plug, because I think really oral history, there are a lot of opportunities, I think, for potentially really interesting interdisciplinary work. And I think it's just an area where perhaps for management scholars, the barriers to interact with historical methods are going to be lower, or maybe maybe it is just a little bit too similar. I'm not so sure. So this sort of concludes a little bit the part 2 about the methods. Obviously, this is very closely related to the data, because data methods, obviously, they belong quite closely together. But I think finally, I wanted to come to the subject of theory. Emmanuella already highlighted this sense of historians have no theory. And I think that there was a whole phase where I think collaborations with historians were often seen, they're the people who do the data collection. So yeah, a little bit the data monkeys, hence this picture. I'm not sure I find this monkey somewhat scary, but this was the least scary I could find. And I have to say, while I thought this was sort of over, I was at an organization studies conference a few years ago in a session on archival research, which was run by management scholars. And what they said at the end was, we're not historians because we do theory. And I sat there and thought, wow, this is really offensive. Because realistically, I feel historians do theory. They might understand theory different. And to some extent, maybe this is a problem because that allows other people to miss the fact that there's theoretical richness in historical perspectives. And also, I'd say the way theory gets embedded into narratives also goes back to this question, should we use narrative as a presentation or analysis? Very often we've used narrative, and that perhaps hides the theory in the perspective of management scholars. So I very much disagreed with this notion, historians don't do theory. I also thought, interesting, so what would you do if historians also did theory? But that's a different question. And a few years ago, with my co-authors, we wrote an article about what we called historiographical reflexivity. It's a mouthful, I realized that. But what this term really means is the idea that we should take insights from history seriously, and seriously in the sense of as a source of concepts and theorizing. So ideas that you can reformat into something that is recognizably a business management organization theory, and not just as data and methods. I mean, as you can see, data and methods clearly to me are very important, but I wouldn't say this is the be all and end all. And one example here of actually an extremely successful loaning of concepts from history, I would argue, is rhetorical history. Now, for me, I'm not sure rhetorical history is really history, because it focuses very much on memory and strategic uses of the past in organizations. It's been an incredibly successful line of investigation, of theorization since this initial article by Sotheby et al. in 2010. And that article, or sort of article book chapters in a strange series, really builds on the work from leading historians, and it's very explicit about it. There's nothing hidden. The author's very deeply engaged with this historical research, in particular Eric Hobsbawm's work with Terence Ranger on the invention of tradition, massively influential in history, and Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, where he looks at nations and the rise of nationalism, really as a form of communities that are imagined because they're too big to be experienced. And so they really deal with some major driving forces in 20th century history. And by rhetorical historians, this has been really adapted to show how organizations actually strategically invent their own communities, sometimes even their own histories, to position themselves in countries, in industries, towards competitors. And that's been an extremely fruitful line of research. However, I also think this has been so influential because it actually uses very familiar qualitative methods. It uses very much interviews and field work. So very much a methodology that somebody in the field of organization studies would be completely comfortable with. So they're only taking the concepts from history, but they're reformatting that into a theory that's recognizable to management scholars, and then use recognizable theory. So I think just, the alienness of it is limited. So here we have theory derived from historical concepts, not so much historical data and the collection of data or the methods. So unsurprisingly, I kind of believe that if you used all three approaches, maybe you could come up with something more novel, but maybe also this is something that can only happen over time, because clearly theoretical approaches in management take a very specific shape, and in history, they're quite different. And I think historians perhaps, or historical researchers, need to be a little bit clearer about how they use and view theory. There's a whole stream of research. Again, you'll find good descriptions of that in the handbook of the historic turn, where people really argue that history isn't limited to data and methods in terms of what it can contribute to management scholars, but it could also reorient theorizing towards more contextual understanding and long-term processes. And of course, Emmanuella and co-authors have worked a lot around a more contextualizing approach to phenomena in business and international business. And I think it closely aligns with those ideas around bringing context more into theorizing. I think the other aspect's really that it'll also allow qualitative scholars to theorize longer and larger processes than were typically common, particularly in process research, which is very detailed and very specific. I think the other area where historical research can contribute to theory is the ability through this kind of naturally occurring data to look at hidden influences. I think through historical approaches, you reveal some continuities, some disembodied standards, practices, and influences that as individuals, we're probably not aware because they're so much part of our day-to-day practices and everybody around us accepts them. So we probably don't realize. Similarly, we may be subject to organizational or influences beyond the organization that, again, we may not be fully aware of, and that you can only really understand with hindsight from a sort of perspective looking at documents generated by lots of different people and organizations in different contexts. So I think a lot can emerge from these intersections if we can widen the lens to look at bigger issues and bring more context in. And here's really where historical research, I believe, has a lot to offer to management scholars. So to conclude, I think a lot of the time in the last few years, people who try to publish historical research in business and management had to really focus on legitimizing historical sources as a different type of data, to legitimize historical methods as something that isn't familiar to other qualitative social scientists. And the question is really what's next? And I think there is real opportunity to really go into developing new theoretical insights, but also not just loaning them and using them with existing methods. Sure, that's also fine. I have no problem with it. But I think the real potential is by starting to really connect all the different areas where historical research could make a potential contribution. So different types of theorizing might be possible also through just the fact that we have so much naturally occurring data. So some of that theorizing may not even be about the past or historical, right? We might also find we spend more time analyzing the quality of underlying evidence, particularly if you're using data from the digital realm. I think we're all aware that we need to be highly skeptical and need to be able to question and really interrogate where some of this material is coming from and why it's available. And hopefully there's also keener engagement with historiographical concepts, because historians have written about pretty cool things. And if anything, if you read the news today, it's becoming more relevant, and there are plenty of historians who are interviewed all the time in the media. So just because it's in the past doesn't mean it doesn't have contemporary relevance. And hopefully that's also true for some of the concepts that derive from historiography. So I'd really say that historical approaches hopefully are becoming and have become just much more established, and gives us the opportunity to bring together data, methods, and theoretical insights. Very influentially, Peter Clark and Mick Rowlandson wrote a paper on the historic turn many, many years ago, and that's what they were arguing for. And I kind of feel we're now at a point where a lot of this might well be much more possible now, because more people are interested in engaging with this. And in case you want to sort of engage with the community in some of the events, the barcode for the Organizational History Network, where we basically send around any updates and news. So it's an easy way to stay in touch if you're interested. So thank you very much. I hope this was interesting, and this is sort of what you were hoping for. And yeah, I'll look forward to hear any questions or comments from you.